The history of the Marshall amplifier is one that most guitarists are familiar with, but it's likely that few have ever looked into it in detail. Even fewer will know about its humble beginnings. And so, this is how it all started, in the very early times. Before Marshall amplifiers became famous for their distinctive stack design and their unique sound, they were once just an unknown radio repair shop. Founded in London in 1962 by Jim Marshall, the company began its life dealing primarily with repairing televisions and audio equipment. But soon after, it expanded to encompass a whole host of other instruments and electronics. Marshall had actually played drums and bass prior to owning his own repair shop, which was based in a converted garage at the end of his garden. It was here that he would develop the first Marshall amplifier, inspired by the American Fender amplifiers that he was hearing at the time. Having played bass, he knew this instrument required an amplifier capable of producing a powerful, rich tone. So after finding some old military valve amplifiers, he began experimenting with ways to make them smaller and more portable. The result of this was the first iteration of what would become one of the most important pieces of equipment in music history. It was also around this time that the business moved from a garage to an actual store in a North London suburb, which is where the Marshall brand really started to take off. Although it was only a small shop, Marshall made sure that any customers who entered did so through a doorway at the side of the building. This was done to prevent anyone from accidentally wandering into the workshop area where he was developing his prototype amplifiers. But it wasn't long before Jim Marshall found himself faced with a choice. He could continue to work as a radio repairman, or take a chance on trying to sell his own amplifiers to the masses. For him, the decision was simple. He chose to try and sell his own product. And soon enough, the first customers came knocking. One of the first bands to get on board with the new Marshall amplifiers was The Who. This was a great start, but he needed something to put his amplifier on top of. After speaking with Pete Townshend, Jim designed a speaker cabinet that featured two 12-inch Celestion speakers. This proved to be such a hit that the Marshall Bluesbreaker amplifier, which was the name given to the first model, was soon being used by almost every British blues artist worth mentioning, including Eric Clapton and Peter Green. From there, it didn't take long for news of these loud and powerful amps to reach another guitarist, a man who would forever change the face of rock music, Jimi Hendrix. Now, when he first started using Marshalls, they weren't quite what we know today. His amps didn't even have knobs to control the gain, which is a feature that was added later on. In fact, the earliest recordings of Hendrix's Band of Gypsies contained several different models from various manufacturers. But before long, it seemed that everything he played through sounded better when it was run through a Marshall amplifier. And so, this is what led to one of the greatest partnerships in the history of guitar amplifiers. Hendrix had a huge influence on the future direction of the Marshall brand, as he often requested custom modifications to be made to his personal units. One of these requests was for a smaller amplifier head that could be easily transported around, which is where the famed 18-watt model came into play. The success of the 18-watt model led to a larger version called the 50-watt, which was still relatively compact compared to the previous versions of the amp. At this point, the designs were becoming so popular that other companies were copying them. This prompted Marshall to add the now iconic script logo to its products to help distinguish them from copycats. By this time, Marshall had developed a reputation for being able to produce whatever model a customer might request. However, things were about to change in a big way. See, up until this point, most of the amps that Marshall built were designed specifically for blues and other forms of electric guitar. That all changed with the release of the Superbass, an incredibly loud 100-watt amplifier that was designed for bass guitar. Many people were skeptical that such a powerful unit would even be necessary, but they were quickly proven wrong when bands like Led Zeppelin started using them live. This brings us to one of the most famous Marshall amplifiers ever produced, the 1968 Plexi Super Bass. This is the same one that Jimmy Page used during the Yardbirds days and then throughout his career with Led Zeppelin. In terms of design, it's actually very similar to the modern Plexi, except it has an all-tube output stage instead of the solid-state output used in the newer version. Nonetheless, despite these differences, it's widely regarded as one of the best-sounding tube amplifiers ever created. While the Plexi was certainly a massive hit, the original Superbass wasn't far behind. Its power-handling capabilities allowed bassists to push their instruments to levels that had never been seen before. This ultimately led to it being dubbed the loudest bass amp in the world. Some sources claim that it was capable of reaching 130 decibels, which is louder than a chainsaw or a motorcycle. Needless to say, this kind of volume was certainly not suited for indoor use, and so it's no surprise that many musicians opted to use the slightly less extreme Plexi instead. But why did this happen? Why was there a need for such a loud bass amplifier in the first place? Well, back in those days, the average volume level of bands was much higher. Guitarists like Pete Townshend and Jimmy Page were known for playing their instruments at ear-splitting volumes. With everyone playing so loud, it became difficult to hear anything clearly. This led to a new demand for gear that could keep up, gear that could cut through all of the noise and still remain clear. Marshall answered that call with the Super Bass and the Plexi, two amplifiers that could produce a massive sound while still remaining articulate and well-defined. This is why, to this day, many musicians opt to use the Plexi over the JCM 800 or other high-gain models. It is simply impossible to get the same kind of tone out of a high-gain amp, because they don't have the same kind of valves. Those old Mullard power output valves were capable of giving you a very warm, smooth overdrive, something that's much harder to achieve with modern transistors. Another reason for the enduring popularity of the Plexi is its simplicity. Compared to some of the later Marshall amps, the Plexi is relatively easy to repair if something goes wrong. There are fewer valves and simpler circuitry, which means that it's easier to diagnose any problems that may arise. This makes it a very appealing option for touring musicians who need their amp to be reliable and easy to fix if something goes wrong. As you can probably tell by now, the Plexi Superbass is much more than just an amplifier. It's a piece of history. It represents a time when guitarists and bassists were pushing their instruments to new extremes. It's an era of music that we've never really seen since. But what happened next? How did Marshall go from producing one of the best-selling amps of all time to falling behind the competition? Well, the story of the Marshall amplifier doesn't end with the Plexi. In fact, it was only the beginning of a much longer legacy. After the Plexi, Marshall went on to produce a number of other legendary amps, each with their own unique sound and following. The JCM 800, for example, is still one of the most popular high-gain amps ever made. Its punchy, aggressive tone is perfectly suited for a wide range of musical styles, making it a favorite among metal and hard rock guitarists. There's also the JVM series, which offers a wide range of tones from clean and chimey to crunchy and distorted. These amps are prized for their versatility, making them a great choice for musicians who need to cover a lot of ground sonically. Despite the popularity of these later models, though, there's always been a bit of nostalgia surrounding the early days of Marshall. Many guitarists prefer the warmer, more organic sound of the Plexi over the later, higher-gain amps, and that's understandable. The Plexi Superbass was an incredibly innovative amp that helped define the sound of an entire era. It's a classic for a reason. Nonetheless, though, it's important to remember that Marshall didn't stop innovating after the Plexi. They went on to produce a number of other groundbreaking amps that helped shape the course of music history, and while the nostalgia surrounding the Plexi is understandable, it shouldn't overshadow the many other great amps that Marshall has produced over the years. So, what do you think? Are you a fan of the Marshall amplifier? Which model is your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to subscribe. Thanks for watching. Take care.